Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yop, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Dust Bowl, depression, and the exhaustion of local relief. The core question is this: what happens when the bank fails, the soil blows away, and the county relief office runs out of cash in the same season? The core competency is to describe the experiences of Americans caught in the Dust Bowl and uprooted by the Depression. What happens when the bank fails, the soil blows away, and the county relief office runs out of cash in the same season? From 1929 to 1933, the Great Depression turned national economic weakness into daily decisions about food, rent, credit, and movement. Stock values collapsed, businesses failed, wages fell, and banks closed by the thousands. The crisis appeared in breadlines, unpaid mortgages, abandoned farms, and county relief systems running out of money, forcing Americans to confront the limit of a political order built on voluntarism, local charity, and confidence that downturns would correct themselves. The collapse moved through chains of failure. A bank closing destroyed savings and interrupted payroll. A store that lost credit reduced orders. A factory cut shifts or shut down. A farmer unable to renew a loan faced foreclosure, tax sale, or the auction of livestock and equipment. Families doubled up with relatives, delayed marriages, pulled children from school, pawned property, and moved in search of work. The emergency became a question of state capacity because the county poor fund and the church kitchen could not absorb losses on that scale. The Dust Bowl intensified the crisis by adding ecological ruin to market collapse. Drought struck the southern plains after years of deep plowing, fragile monoculture, and debt-driven overproduction, and wind carried topsoil out of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico in black blizzards. Falling prices and environmental breakdown pushed rural families onto roads westward, remaking labor markets and public memory. By the early 1930s, Depression politics had become inseparable from foreclosure, migration, and the visible exhaustion of local systems. The background to the Depression stretched through the 1920s. Wartime demand had encouraged farmers to expand acreage, borrow for tractors and equipment, and expect continued high prices. After World War I, global production recovered, and agricultural prices sagged. Many rural families remained in debt even during the celebrated prosperity of the decade. Banks in farm regions were already vulnerable before 1929 because they were tied to land values, local crop prices, and small depositor bases. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, it exposed a financial system already carrying weakness in agriculture, construction, and installment credit. Bank failures came in waves. More than 1,300 banks failed in 1930, more than 2,200 in 1931, and nearly 1,500 in 1932, with more closures arriving before Roosevelt's bank holiday in March 1933. These were not abstract institutional losses. Depositors lost working cash, merchants lost credit lines, counties lost tax receipts, state budgets tightened under balanced budget habits. Relief offices faced more applicants with less revenue. In industrial cities, unemployment climbed toward a quarter of the workforce by 1933. Men sold apples on sidewalks. Women stretched soup and bread, and children wore patched clothing through several winters. Hoovervilles appeared on the edges of cities from Seattle to St. Louis, built from scrap lumber, tar paper, and cast-off tin. The rural economy carried its own harsher arithmetic. Mortgage payments did not fall because wheat, cotton, and corn prices fell. Seed dealers still required payment. County tax collectors still posted notices. Sheriffs still conducted foreclosure sales. In parts of Iowa and the Plains, farmers formed protest groups to block sales or intimidate bidders, but debt law continued to move through courts and county administration. The structure of ownership shaped exposure. Tenants, sharecroppers, and small owner-operators were more exposed than large landholders with deeper reserves. Mechanization increased output in good years and deepened displacement when prices broke. Commodity figures made that arithmetic brutal. Cotton that had sold above 30 cents a pound during wartime fell near 6 cents in the early 1930s, and wheat prices dropped low enough that some farmers burned grain for fuel because it could not cover transport costs. County agents, local bankers, and implement dealers could all see the same problem in their books. The collateral still existed, but the market value beneath the loan had collapsed. When local banks called notes or refused renewal, foreclosure moved through ordinary legal instruments rather than dramatic decree, which is why the crisis could feel bureaucratic even while it was devastating. Relief before the New Deal remained primarily local and private. Municipal governments, counties, religious charities, and community chests distributed cash, food, coal, and clothing, but their resources collapsed under the scale of demand. President Herbert Hoover believed direct federal relief would weaken character, displace local responsibility, and create dangerous dependency. He preferred cooperation between business leaders, state governments, and private organizations. That philosophy had some continuity with earlier American practice. By 1931 and 1932, it looked increasingly detached from the magnitude of mass unemployment and farm failure. Hoover did act in limited institutional ways. His administration supported the Federal Home Loan Bank Act in 1932 and created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that same year. The RFC was designed to lend federal funds to banks, railroads, insurance companies, and later some state relief efforts in order to stabilize key institutions. The problem was scale and direction. The RFC moved through loans to institutions rather than direct cash relief to ordinary households. Assistance often came slowly, required collateral, and looked remote to jobless families standing in soup lines. Hoover believed institutional stabilization would restore confidence from the top down. Voters increasingly concluded that recovery was not reaching them. Migrant families from the Dust Bowl faced pressure at every step of departure. The term Okies was often applied broadly to migrants from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and surrounding states, whether or not they were actually from Oklahoma. Families packed bedding, cookware, children, and spare parts into worn automobiles and trucks and traveled west on routes such as U.S. Highway 66. California growers and labor contractors sometimes promised work that proved seasonal, underpaid, or unavailable. Migrants camped in roadside ditches, river bottoms, and makeshift settlements with poor sanitation and little legal protection. Local authorities in California tried at times to block entry, police mobility, or clear camps, reflecting fears that newcomers would burden counties and lower wages. The ecological crisis behind that movement was severe. Drought settled over the plains and stages after 1931. High winds stripped exposed fields, dust entered lungs, machinery, bedding, and drinking water. Livestock suffocated or starved. Farm women sealed windows with wet cloths, swept dirt repeatedly from floors and tables, and tried to keep children indoors during the worst storms. Federal soil conservation policy would expand later, but in the early years, families relied on thinning savings, neighbors, and local merchants who were themselves near failure. Migration was usually a forced logistical decision rather than a romantic search for opportunity. Federal and state observers eventually recorded camp conditions in great detail. The Farm Security Administration later sponsored migratory labor camps with water pumps, wash houses, and administrative oversight, but those facilities reached only a fraction of the migrant population. Before that development, many families slept in tents, car bodies, or brush shelters, paid camp fees when required, and searched daily for picking jobs in cotton, grapes, peaches, or lettuce. Labor contractors could cut wages sharply because so many desperate workers were on the road. Migration therefore connected environmental disaster to labor oversupply and county-level conflict over schools, sanitation, and relief obligations. The bonus army made the legitimacy crisis visible in the nation's capital. In the summer of 1932, thousands of World War I veterans and their families gathered in Washington to demand early payment of a service bonus that Congress had scheduled for 1945. They built camps, the largest on the Anacostia Flats, and petitioned Congress after the House passed an early payment bill that the Senate rejected. Hoover feared disorder and insisted on clearing some occupied buildings. On July 28, 1932, Attorney General William D. Mitchell authorized federal action. Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur directed troops, with Dwight D. Eisenhower serving as a major and George S. Patton leading cavalry units. Infantry with fixed bayonets, cavalry, and tear gas drove veterans from camps and burned shelters. The scene damaged Hoover more deeply than any speech about balanced budgets. The bonus camps had developed their own internal order before the assault. Veterans organized sanitation details, mess lines, and informal security, and they tried to present themselves as disciplined petitioners rather than as revolutionaries. Their demand rested on the Adjusted Compensation Act of 1924, which had promised certificates redeemable in 1945. By 1932, unemployed veterans wanted immediate cash because mortgage arrears, rent, and food bills would not wait 13 more years. When federal troops treated that claim as a public order threat, the argument about relief became inseparable from the argument about citizenship and state force. Hoover's institutional response still stopped short of direct relief. The RFC eventually expanded lending authority to include some agricultural credit bodies and state relief channels, but the design continued to privilege banks, railroads, and large institutions as the first point of rescue. That approach revealed a hierarchy inside emergency policy. Washington could move paperwork and capital toward major borrowers while families waited on county warrants, church kitchens, and seasonal labor rumors. The visible gap between institutional stabilization and household survival became one of the central political facts of 1932. When Roosevelt stood before the Capitol on March 4, 1933, banks were closing, relief offices were overwhelmed, and the road west was already crowded with displaced farm families. His line about fear itself was chosen to steady a panicked public, but the sharper political move came when he declared that the nation's urgent duty was to put people to work. That sentence shifted unemployment out of the category of private failure and into the category of federal responsibility. The speech was aimed against a governing tradition Hoover had defended to the end. Hoover had relied on voluntarism, budget caution, institutional lending through the RFC, and the hope that confidence would return if the financial structure could be stabilized. Roosevelt used the inaugural to clear ground for a different order: emergency banking legislation, direct work programs, agricultural intervention, and a larger national administrative reach. The words on the page announced that the old relief scale had broken. They also landed in a country already trained by catastrophe. County relief budgets were exhausted, charity kitchens were overwhelmed. Migrant camps from Oklahoma to California showed what happened when drought, foreclosure, and labor oversupply collided on the highway. The bonus army removal had already demonstrated how far the federal government could move to defend property and how little it had moved to defend the unemployed. Roosevelt was speaking into that record of exhaustion, and every phrase had to persuade listeners that Washington would now act in a different register. The inaugural did not feed a family or reopen a closed bank by itself. It supplied authority, tempo, and public justification for the actions that would follow within days. Its force lay in timing. The country heard a president declare that the Depression had exceeded the moral and administrative capacity of the existing order, and that declaration made the next round of federal intervention politically possible. The immediate consequence of the pre-New Deal years was a collapse of confidence in local sufficiency. Volunteer drives, community chests, and business pledges could not carry mass unemployment and regional ecological disaster. Roosevelt's 1932 victory reflected that conclusion because millions of voters had come to believe that the national government would have to assume a larger share of economic responsibility than Hoover had claimed. The Dust Bowl changed the social geography of the United States as well. Migrants carried labor, culture, and resentment westward. California agribusiness gained a vulnerable seasonal workforce, while local governments argued over camp sanitation, policing, and relief costs. The memory later lived through Dorothea Lange's photographs, federal reports, and Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, but the historical core was more material than symbolic. Roadside camps, county ledgers, wage competition, and relief systems under strain. Hoover's reputation remained tied to institutional caution. The RFC showed that he accepted some federal action, but the loans were indirect and too slow to alter public expectation. The bonus army removal gave the broader failure a public image when veterans seeking early payment met cavalry charges and burning camps on the Anacostia Flats. Financial crisis and civic abandonment became linked in one scene. By March 1933, the country had reached a threshold, but the judgment problem was still unsettled. If local charity, county relief, and voluntary recovery failed under national weight, then federal duty had to widen. Yet once Washington accepted that duty, there was no obvious limit to where responsibility should stop when banks, weather, labor markets, and household survival all collapsed together.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.